Do you have that? Do you have that sheet? No. Oh, you
Do you
do?
want me to print it?
I don't know. What do we
I
have to
was
do?
just gonna like send it out on the Google Doc, but they can't edit it.
Who?
The like to the kids.
What? Where
The
you send that?
yeah. Term sheet.
Oh, yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. No, I wasn't,
Oh,
but
sorry. Where were we?
oh,
I have
are
the-
you gonna you gonna send the roster
Yeah,
around?
I have
Okay.
it.
All right. You can, yeah, you know what you're doing. You just go.
I'm a little behind things.
No, it's okay. No, it's fine. I'm just gonna squeeze over where you're at here. Use that microphone so they can hear me. Okay. Do you know if if nobody comes on, we don't really need to walk around.
Right.
So just keep an eye on it.
I
If
was looking at my sheet and two of them are back. What was it? She said Stephanie was back and so I don't know about these two. I sent them out.
okay.
So
Yeah, if they don't pop up, then by the time, because I got to go through some of this stuff first.
yeah. I sent them.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Well, good morning. Last time we went through utilitarianism a little bit more in detail. And this is one of the things that I like to do as we go through the dilemmas. So the dilemmas will help us make sense of it. And what I found out is as I space this out over time, and this is what you're starting to figure out, I just kind of give you a little bit as we go. So next week, we're going to start looking at corporate ethics, right? That's the topic. And you're going to do a little bit of reading on that. The prelude to that in the slides will be just a review of virtue ethics. That's the one that we haven't really hit on, yet really in any great detail. So that's kind of how this, I kind of play this out. And then once we get through virtue ethics, we'll just sort of hit those topics then as we go along, because those are the ones that we're really focused on. The other one that we're going to allude to today, that's part of distributive justice, is contractarianism is one of the ways it's referred to, but it's really stems from the writings of John Rawls, who published his famous book in 1970 called A Theory of Justice, which you may or may not have heard. It's about 4 inches thick. It's a incredibly challenging read, to say the least. But I'm going to kind of give you a very, very abridged version of kind of what he's thinking. But before we get to Rawls's work, let's talk a little bit about what we mean by distributive justice, because this is directly tied to what we were supposed to get to today. We're a little bit behind. We're going to talk about the difference between equality and equity, right? So hot topic out there today as we go through distributive justice, which you'll see how it relates to equity. You're going to start to recognize lots of ways that this is being communicated in different forms out there in the political arena, in corporate America, and just in organizations generally in our society. So here's sort of a definition of distributive justice. It refers to, and remember, highlight these words because they're words I want you to think about. It doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be on the test or anything like that. These are, when I have a word in blue, it's a word I want you to kind of just, this is getting you to that point of thinking about logical fallacies. And remember when we started this course, I said on the side, make sure you're getting yourself caught up on what logical fallacies are. All you got to do is Google them. You can find a million different, videos and of the common logical fallacies. There's only about 10 of them that I would say that you really, should be familiar with. Familiarity is really the only level we're going to get to with logical fallacies today. I don't expect you to memorize the logical fallacies or anything. The key to understanding logical fallacies is that when you're answering the questions, whether it be on an exam or on one of the short essays, that you're not making a logical fallacy while you're doing it. Otherwise, when you get your paper back, I'm going to point out which logical fallacy exactly you've just committed, okay? And that will help you, understand better for the next time. And kind of that's sort of the progression as we go. Okay, so when we look at the term distributive justice and what it means today, you can see I highlighted the word perceived fairness. Um, well, herein lies one of the difficulties in what we're discussing, and we look across the society today and some of the issues and challenges that we have, and it really has to do with, well, what do I say all the time? Well, what do we mean by perceived justice? Okay, we could tear apart each one of those words. And in philosophy, that's what we tend to do. We tend to focus on language. Some of you may be familiar with Wittgenstein if you've had any philosophy at all. Wittgenstein was very much into the language and how it changes and how it's used by people in different ways for their own ends, in spite of another person being used as the means to that ends. Does this make sense? So I think that here, this is about the most concise one that I could find. And one of the reasons I like it is because it points out the fact that this is very popular with organizational scholars. In fact, if you've taken organizational behavior, which how many of you have taken OB yet? That's part of B Corps, I would assume, right? Yeah, okay. You probably talked about organizational justice within OB. So we're going to talk about it from a little bit of a different perspective. So when we go through the dilemmas, we're going to go through at least one today. It'll be one of the abstract ones. And I want you to think of distributive justice, but I want you to think of it not in terms of legalities or what you would see play or what you think would play out in a courtroom. Okay, I want you to think of it in terms of the things that we've been discussing, right? I want you to try and form arguments in your mind, and it's okay to be conflicted with those arguments, because one of the you know how I go with the abstract first and then we kind of go to a real world. When we get to the real world, it's one that even myself, like I'm struggling with, you know, the sort of the justice of it at the end of the day. So that's the kind of thing I want you to think about. And distributive justice leans on these three rules, they call them. But the thing I want you to notice about equity, equality, and need is that what you're going to see as I go forward here is that the need is really can be folded into equity. And so it's hard to parse that out sometimes. And if you bear with me, I think you'll see what I mean. So here's the sort of the objective of distributive justice in our society, that social goods are the object of this distributive justice. Now, that's an important sentence because social goods mean shared goods. But the question really becomes, and this is one of the great struggles that we have, the fights in our political system and things like that, we ask the question, what are social goods? Okay, what is social, what belongs to the collective and what belongs to the individual, right? And this is a difficult question to answer, especially in a society that, you know, is trying to balance sort of that pure capitalist kind of thinking where you know, free markets and, you know, people are left to their own. That's sort of the notion of equality in that way, and we'll get into that in more detail, as opposed to sort of balancing, you know, well, what, you know, who needs help, right? And there's this problem of needs. What does need mean, right? It's sort of like, where does need end? And, you know, what's the word I want? You know, sort of giving away for free begin, you know, or something like that. Does this make sense? So this is struggle there to try to parse that out. Social meanings are historical in character. And so distributions and just and unjust distributions can change over time. So not only do we recognize that we're having a challenge in the current state, we have to think about the problems that these dilemmas that we're going to look at. I want you to look at them not only in the short term. Okay, most of you have had principles of economics. You remember the difference between the short term and the long term. A lot of times they'll put years even on that. I think it was like 3 years or so was the short term in principles, and the long term was somewhere around 10 years or something like that. That's just a framework. It's not a, you know, a definite, but you can kind of think of it in those kind of terms. In other words, as you look at these problems, think about what the ramifications might be 20 years from now or something like that, and think of them what they are today, and see if you think that there's a problem with the way that they would be applied, the same principles would be applied later on if things were to change. For example, the population is constantly changing in this country of like who's in the minority, who's in the majority. It changes whether we're talking about political, it changes whether we're talking about race and ethnicity and things like that. All those things are slowly changing over time. And so as we go through these questions, I think they're important things to consider. Every social good or set of good constitutes a distributive sphere within which only certain criteria and arrangements are appropriate. This generates a concept of complex equality. And that was a quote that I pulled. And I was interested in the term complex equality because to me, it was almost, well, let me ask you, if you think about the construct that we talked about, Albert Bandura's construct of moral disengagement, where do you think a term like complex equality might fall in his construct? Can anybody offer an answer to that? Has to do with language. Could it be used as euphemistic labeling? Because really when I read complex equality, I asked myself this question, and this is the question I want you to start asking yourself. What's the difference between complex equality and equity? And as I delve further into it, I realized that they were very muddled. So then I asked myself, is complex equality like sort of the new euphemism for equity? Because people are starting to turn against the term equity, okay? And it has to do with the way goods and services and things like that are being distributed, okay? So here's some of the current issues that many of you are well aware of. Theories of distributive justice seek to allocate society's resources on the basis of just principles. What's the question there? What are just principles? Who decides what the just principles are, right? We have a way in this country of deciding that in a democratic republic. I told you I used to live in the UK. They have more of a pure democracy over there where they have referendums. I gave you an example of one that went horribly wrong for them. You can just ask anybody that lives over there. Was Brexit, right? Brexit was a referendum, pure democratic vote. 51, it was the final vote was 51-49. And what happened almost the entire country of Scotland voted against Brexit. And that's when they wanted to separate off into their own country. And that's actually still being discussed. So do you see the kind of problems that some of these things can cause? When we start talking about minorities, sometimes we're talking about 49% of the population, okay? And this is the challenge that we face sometimes. People just say, oh, well, it's, whoever wins the vote, that's what right is. And that's kind of the point that we are in a lot of aspects of society. The majority makes the right, except the minority, especially look around in this country, it's very divided, right? There's a lot of divisiveness. And so what we have this almost two majorities a lot of times. They're very close to like 50% of the population. And one of them is sort of like left off to the side. And if it's not handled in the right way, we wind up with what we see going across, I think, the society today that's trickling down all the way down into corporate America. And you can see this. I can't even tell you the number of news stories I've read over the past couple of weeks about these type of things when it comes to like mask mandates and things like that, that has to do with airlines, for example. Remember, most of you have heard about the airline controversy. Now there's the truckers that I think I saw that about yesterday with the truckers up in Canada, right? And they're, and people are saying, why are they required to wear a mask? They're in a truck, and stuff like that. And these strange kind of questions. So we have to think about those kind of things and put them in perspective of these moral principles. That's what I want to do in this. I don't want to think about the legalities of it, but when we start thinking about things like distributive justice, you have to ask yourself a question. And this actually had to do with the schools I saw the other day. Somebody asked the question about, well, we're focused on, the masks. They said that it was the new Johns Hopkins study that came out. And they said something to the effect of the masks, they don't work, they only 2.2% of the population. But somebody brought up an interesting point that started me thinking. It's like, well, what about the ones that are vulnerable, that have like some sort of autoimmune deficiency or something like that. I don't remember the examples they gave, but this is what was kind of going through my head. And I said, well, I don't know. That's a complex question. There's a lot of different ways you can answer that question, right? And I think that's part of the issue that we have now is how, what is the best way maybe to answer questions like that? Well, Rawls offers this idea of contractarianism, and he offers sort of this ideal state. And it's a theory of distributive shares in which just allocation of benefits and burdens of social life is determined by what rational persons would choose from behind a veil of ignorance. Now, the first words I pointed out there are rational persons. Remember what I said about rationality? Whenever you hear rational, we used to talk about it in economics all the time. Everything's based on, in fact, microeconomics, the definition of microeconomics is the study of rational choice, right? The problem with that is McIntyre wrote that thick book on it, the whole book, and it's titled "Whose Justice, Which Rationality?" And this is his whole point. It's like, who decides what's just, who decides what's rational, right? So there's this problem. Well, Rawls tries to salvage that his theory and solve that problem through this thing called the veil of ignorance. And this prevents, basically what he's getting at with the veil of ignorance is like, think of yourself as being born of not knowing where you were going to be born, how you were going to enter the world. You had no knowledge about how you were going to enter the world. You didn't know if you were going to enter the world in a very wealthy family or in a very poor country. You had no idea. That's what he means by the veil of ignorance. Okay. And when you're thinking of that, from his perspective, if that's your start point, it will lead you to sort of the best way to sort of make decisions about things and form social contracts. In other words, if we're all thinking in this way of entering the world through the veil of ignorance, through Rawls's veil of ignorance, not knowing where we're starting, not knowing what talents we're going to be offered, not knowing, how tall I'm going to be, maybe I want to be an NBA player. Well, I'm not 7 foot. So, probably, that's going to be a challenge for me, right? There's lots of other reasons, but it's just an example, right? So these are the kind of things that Rawls is trying to fix with his veil of ignorance. And so he concludes that people behind such a veil would adopt what he calls the difference principle. Primary goods, not only wealth, income, and opportunity, but also the basis of self-respect would be distributed to the maximal advantage of a representative member of the least advantaged social class. Now, I took a pause there because I want you to take that in for a second. Maximal advantage to the least advantaged social class. One of the challenges with Rawls's theory is what I started with earlier, and I said that things change over time, right? So one of the challenges with implementing contractarianism in its pure form is to try to adapt as we go over time, right? Remember, I mentioned the demographics in this country. The demographics in this country over your lifetime. In fact, many of you may be in like senior management positions when some of the major demographics in our society are supposed to change, right? I mean, that's what the predictions are, at least anyway. As far as like who's in the majority, who's in the minority, when it comes to the big Ds, we used to call them the big Ds, the big diversity aspects, race, ethnicity, religion, things like that. All those things are changing constantly. And so Rawls tries to take that into account, but it's a challenge. Okay. And that's what you should take from it. So we talked about contractarianism, utilitarianism, and consequentialism. And I just put this up to help you remember the contrast. Okay. So remember, we just got done talking about all those things that are based in consequentialist theory, right? Utilitarianism, Rawls's contractarianism, it's based in consequentialist theory, right? And I just wanted to remind you what Kant would say, right? He would say reasoning should prevail in determining right. Reasoning alone, right? He was very big into reasoning. And remember the time Kant was becoming, popular, if you want to call it that. This was a time where the church was heavily involved in running the universities. In fact, they ran the universities, and it's one of the reasons why certain philosophers were banned from universities, because they were basically run as religious organizations. And when the philosophers would write something that was sort of against, the theology of the time, whatever it might be, they were, some of them even had to go to certain countries. You'll see a lot of philosophers fled to Holland at certain points, because Holland was sort of a free state, a free thinking kind of state. And so there were several that left England because they were being persecuted, France because they were being persecuted, and they would wind up in Holland. But remember, this is this little bit of a contrast, and you can see what we just talked about, and then think of, with Kant, he was all about duty. There's an obligation not to lie, remember? And so, I just want to remind you the difference. Kant would say you can't lie no matter what. Well, we just got done with a couple different ways of thinking about lying. For example, we could make a contract and we could agree that lying in this situation would be a good thing. That happens even at the governmental level. I mean, essentially, we have an entire system set up of security. I had a top secret security clearance, right? I had access to certain information that other people don't have access to. Is that a lie? Well, I don't know. It sort of depends on how you look at it, right? I mean, withholding of information, is that a lie? Some Americans are very opposed to any kind of withholding of information. On the other hand, if we let that information out, we're giving it to the whole world. So you see the balance of that we're trying to reach there, and it's sort of a struggle in some cases, especially when it comes to Kant's like categorical thinking, where he starts with his imperative of the great his imperative of the sort of like the rephrasing of the golden rule kind of thinking, and what he does is he takes that and builds his entire moral system from that principle, which is basically, you want to be treated like others treat you, and that's the maxim, and that's kind of our start point, right? And so that's different than consequentialist thinking, where we're really focused on what we think the consequences are going to be, and we want to make them turn out right, and that's what becomes the right and the good. Does this make sense? Okay. So now we want to get into equity and equality, and this was interesting for me to put together. Because there's so much going on out there about equity and equality right now, and as I was searching, through the internet and kind of like looking like what sort of the current trends are and things like that, I found some very interesting thing, and it all really begins with fundamental definitions. What I was trying to do was I was trying to find a concise definition of equality and equity. And it was difficult. In fact, if you try to just go on the internet, you're going to find definitions that don't even look alike. And I'm going to show you an example of that. So here's one definition I found for equality: the state of being equal, especially in status, rights, and opportunities. And this is opposed to equity, where the absence of avoidable or remediable differences among groups of people, whether those groups are defined socially, economically, demographically, or geographically. Now, the second definition is obviously a passive definition. And then I remember I just brought this up. I mentioned it last time, but this was on my mind at the time because I had just seen a story about the consternation over the Supreme Court pick. And so I was thinking about that when I was thinking about, looking at all these definitions of equality and equity. So let me go to my other one here. So now let's talk about the difference between equality and equity. And I don't know why I have ethics there. I meant equity. I think I just typed it wrong. So this is now we need to put our thinking hats on, because remember, there's a couple aspects here. I'm giving you frameworks to think about things in a new way, but without you investing in these arguments, without you sort of trying to reason yourself through these arguments, it's really just perishable knowledge, and it's not worth that much. So that's why we kind of do things this way. It's kind of what Socrates meant. He meant, if you don't even know yourself, how are you supposed to make judgments about the world or other people? And Socrates pointed out that wisdom takes two things. Remember I told you that? And I wasn't trying to offend anyone. I was just trying to say that's what he was just stating a fact that, if you have no experience, you can have all the knowledge in the world, but you don't have anything to contextualize it. There's no way to make sense of it. And so you can't have wisdom in that way. On the other hand, you could be 90 years old, have lived a incredible life and acquired very little knowledge over that life and had lots of experiences, but are still completely befuddled by things that you would otherwise not be if you had acquired the knowledge to make sense of that experience, right? Okay, so here's the dilemma we have for today. Now I'll read the dilemma for you, and then I want you to think about, when you answer this dilemma, think about it. Don't go to virtue ethics yet. Let's get a handle on consequentialism and deontology, and let's see if as you answer this, you can lean on something that we've talked about with consequentialism would include utilitarianism and contractarianism kind of thinking, the social contract, right? Rousseau actually started that, by the way, and it wasn't Rawls who came up with that. It's just sort of been around for a very long time and morphed over history. Rawls kind of just brought it together in 1970 with his book that's been used a lot if you guys wind up in law school, you'll study where a lot of the laws came from, and it was from over the past 30, 40 years. It's been a lot of Rawlsian kind of thinking. But let's take a look at this dilemma here. So in Europe, a woman was near death from cancer. One drug might save her, a form of radium that a druggist in the same town had recently discovered. The druggist was charging $2,000, 10 times what the drug had cost him to make. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money, but he could get together only about half of what it should cost. He told the druggist that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it cheaper or let him pay later, but the druggist said no. The husband got desperate, broke into the man's store, and stole the drug for his dying wife. So this is one of those abstract dilemmas. From what we've discussed, what do you think is the right thing to do here? Was the husband right in stealing the drug? How many think that the husband, it was okay for the husband, it was the right thing to do for the husband to steal the drug? Let me see how many. Good. How many say he should not have stolen the drug? Okay, so a little bit more looks like if you think that it was okay for him to steal the drug. So let's get some reasoning why you think that might be the case. Who would like to offer a reason why you thought that? Let's start off with the majority. Why Heinz should steal the drug. What would your reasoning be?
So I would say that it kind of depends how dire the situation is. I don't know. Okay. Yeah, I don't know how dire the situation is. Like if he had even a week to figure out something else, maybe he should have been a little bit more rash and try to see if there's absolutely any other possibility. But if it is a matter of hours, she could die the next morning type thing, then you kind of just have to do what you do. Yeah.
Sailors in the boat, right? And poor Parker, sacrifice Parker to save the. That's a utilitarian type of argument. Who else was in the majority?
Sorry. Oh. Okay, someone else after that.
I mean, if you think about
You might have to speak up. Because
if you think about like deontology though, the druggist is in the wrong because I mean he kind of has a right to help people, but his duty is to help people and the right to life. So I'm thinking that the druggist is kind of in the wrong because the woman is needing help and he's kind of the person that's he has a duty to save people with the drugs that he's making.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, I've been doing this a while, and I don't remember hearing that argument. It makes sense, right? Because it kind of goes back to the remember the tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the kind of argument that's being used here is the same with the organ transplants, right? Some of you were uncomfortable with that, and it really came down to the doctors. I always make fun of call them hippopotamuses. What do they call it? The oaths that the doctors take.
Oh, the
Hippocratic
Hippocratic
oath, right?
oath. Yeah.
So,
not
you know, right? I mean, that's where you're going with this, right? And what do we call it in corporations a lot of times? Codes of conduct, right? Things like this, right? So the doctor had an obligation to a code. Right? This is a deontological argument, right? Good, very good. You were in the majority, right? Yeah.
I think going off of consequentialism, the husband had the right because the consequences of, breaking into the house and stealing the drug would be far less than his wife dying.
So you think it's okay that he's
Yeah.
okay? And what was your name?
Because of consequentialism, the consequences of, breaking into the druggist's house and stealing the drug in the husband's mind is a lot less than his wife dying from the cancer.
Remember, on the one hand, we're speaking of the moral age, right? That's who he's speaking of, moral age of Heinz. Right? Heinz is about to lose a loved one. Don't we have empathy for Heinz? Poor Heinz. He's losing someone he loves. Right? This comes out a lot today with things such as emotivism. There's a whole. Remember, I told you there's a lot of talk about morality being based in emotions, things like that, and feelings. Right? There's a lot of writings out there on that. There's a lot of opposition to it too. But in your case, you're saying, as far as Heinz is concerned, from his perspective, it was okay to steal the drug because otherwise he would lose his love. Right? Good. That's good. Now let's hear from somebody in the minority that thinks that Heinz should not steal the drug. Who'd like to volunteer a reason that Heinz should not steal the drug? Maybe I should have started with the minority. There are good reasons.
I guess a statement that just kind of stood out to me was like the second sentence where it says one drug might save her. So like the risk of like him breaking into like the druggist location and stealing the form of radium and it possibly saving her isn't worth the consequence of going to jail or risking whatever for stealing the actual drug.
Good. That's it about that answer. Then focus on the words that I threw in there and see if anybody would catch it. You can write this dilemma a little bit different, right? I could write this dilemma in a way that would have taken that argument away, but you caught it. And that's one of the things I want you to start doing. I want you to start listening to the words that they're using and saying, well, what does that mean, right? Well, might is quite an important word here in this case, because what you're saying is you're essentially countering what was said earlier a little bit in a way, because you're saying this is the problem with consequentialism. Heinz isn't sure in this case that the drug would save his life, right? Is there anyone else that would like to take a different perspective on defending Heinz? Yes.
I'm not sure if it's right, but like I can't remember. You use a different word than egoism. I can't remember what it is, but yeah, I feel like egoism. I feel like another problem with egoism is that like they're both thinking about themselves in this problem. So I mean, they're both kind of right. So the doctor or the druggist wants the money, obviously. So he's only thinking about what he's gaining from the situation. And then Hines is only thinking about what he wants out of the situation, which is to save his wife. So they're both being, you can't say really selfish, but I mean, like, they're both kind of being selfish to each other.
Very good. I like the selfish part. Now, let me expand on that. Hold that for a second.
Okay.
I
know,
they,
we might
they,
need
won't- they won't hear.
to-
They won't be able to hear me. So the selfish part. This is important. Okay, so let me add one little twist to this and see if we can get it. If I can get anyone to give me a response. So if think about Hines stealing the drug, most of you said it was okay for Hines to steal the drug, right? Now, let's take this to a large society. If Hines is validated in stealing the drug, what would Kant say? He would, first of all, he would categorically say it was wrong, right, to steal the drug. Categorically. It's just wrong. Doesn't matter about emotion, doesn't matter about, it's just wrong to steal. And the question is why would it be wrong for Hines to steal in light of a society? Can anyone offer yeah.
I kind of got a question about that. So couldn't you say it'd be wrong for the druggist to hold something that would save someone's life if he doesn't need it though as well?
Can you say that again, please?
So like, could you like turn around and say that it would be wrong for the druggist to hold that drug that would save her life if he doesn't need it?
Well, we have
Continue.
I feel like that doesn't work like that though, because deontology is like he has the right to help somebody. I mean, like, wait, I forget what was that what he was saying?
So it's just like, you like kind of turn around and say that the druggist is wrong.
That's what I was saying earlier with the deontology, is that he had the right and duty to help the person.
Didn't the druggist have the right and duty to sell the drug for whatever price he wants? It's his drug. He owns the drug. I mean, I appreciate the appeal to the code of conduct. I'm trying to make a little bit of a different argument. Don't they both have rights? So whose right is right?
I was just gonna like jump in on this like here like debate like if the druggist were to like give it to like one individual person, who's to say that he isn't supposed to like offer it to like the whole society, like the society point that you were bringing up, and then like have it mass produced to save other people who have this same like type of cancer?
Yeah, so society, right? This is kind of what sort of the problem. People like being caught and saying, well, if you stick to this one thing, it works in some situations, but not the other. And consequentialism or utilitarianism works in some situations and not the other. If we go back to the thing, what moral principle is our foundation? This is good. That's a very good answer. Does anyone else have anything they wanted to add? Please.
So the husband, so the question is like, is the husband right and why? I think the husband knows he's wrong, but he's still willing to do it. You know?
Why do you think he'd still be willing to do it?
Because his wife's life is at risk. And I mean, like, he's probably willing to go to jail or pay this druggist back in the future. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of left out of this. Like, he probably does know that what he is doing is morally wrong in a sense because he's stealing, but I think he's still willing to do it.
Essentially, what you're saying is what I'm hearing. tell me if I'm wrong, what I'm hearing is Hines is disengaging from his own moral self-sanctions because he knows it's wrong. But in this case, he's choosing to go against his own moral principles, and there's some mechanism he's using for that. We could call it maybe emotion. We could call it, whatever it might be. But what do you think some of the mechanisms that, from Bandura's construct of moral disengagement? What mechanism might Hines use to disengage from his own moral self-sanction, even though he knew it was wrong? Let's assume Hines knew that it was wrong to steal the drug. He still chose to steal the drug anyway. He would be disengaging from his own moral self-sanctions. What might one of those aspects? Remember the construct? If you can bring it up, or you think about it, we talked about earlier. I mentioned euphemistic labeling. We talked about diffusion of responsibility, displacement of responsibility, moral justification. That construct. What do you think? What do you think, Mike?
I think he's using moral justification, like he's justifying what he's doing because, if he doesn't do it, he loses his wife. And so he's willing to go against what he believes is right.
Moral justification is focused on what part of it. Remember the graphic where some of them were focused on the victim? Remember dehumanization? That one was focused on the victim. Focused on the conduct. Right? He's focused on the conduct there. He's justifying the conduct of an action. Probably because, like the mentioned earlier, he has this investment behind that he has this investment on one hand. But on the other hand, the druggist has an investment as well, right? And there's different ways he finds to look at that investment.
Going along the same lines, like he said, moral justification. Just because it's not like he just went and stole the drug. He originally asked the druggist to make it cheaper, considering he's it says 10 times what the drug had cost him to make it. So is there even a moral justification for him to sell it at that price? So if there's not a moral justification for him to sell it at that price, then why wouldn't he sell it for cheaper or what? So
in Heinz's mind, he's processed this, and this is. I agree with you. I think this is a good example of moral justification in Heinz's mind. The question is, it doesn't work. Does it work in a societal context, organizational context? All the time. It happens in corporations and organizations. It just happens in different ways. Somebody's might not be dying, but maybe somebody's not getting promoted, or maybe somebody's not getting hired. Remember we talked about that several classes ago with the issues with these are some of the huge issues these days with hiring. Well, I mean, one of the things I asked you to consider was the hiring of the there's obviously a controversy about it, so there's debate about this. So that's good. That's good. So when we think of, so we have that abstract background as we look at the differences between equity and equality. And this is one of the things I wanted to show you, is that as you try to find definitions these days, especially, what you find is they're at least convoluted, I think. So here's another definition I found of equality. Equality is the state of being equal, especially in status, rights, and opportunities. And then equity in the passive is the absence of avoidable differences among groups of people, whether those groups are defined socially, economically, or demographically, or geographically. Attempts to, and this next part is the added part, attempts to achieve equity have involved identifying the individual needs of specific populations and implementing steps In other words, taking action to help meet those needs. Now, we brought up a couple of different key points there. What do we mean by needs? Who determines what needs are, right? What about individual needs? The reason I highlighted that. There's an issue there, right? We've talked about it in here in several different ways. We have, on the one hand, we have the moral agent. That's what we're going to call the individual in this class, right? We have the moral agent on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have the plural, right? We have the society, we have the organization, we have corporate America, we have the pluralistic organization. So these are some of those things. And then the specific populations, right? What specific populations? Who gets to choose what populations we're talking about, right? We often talk about disabilities and accommodations and things like that. I'm a disabled combat vet. There's supposed to what is it, Title IX and Title 35. There's these laws out there and stuff that are supposed to protect me from different things and all these things like that. So, but who determined that? Who determined that those laws were fair and equal and equitable? Right? Because these are different meanings, and we just saw with equality, we have definitions that are essentially different from each other, right? And this is one of the things I want you to notice these days, because it's one of the things I noticed in discourse just generally in America, especially, is there seems to me to be a convoluting of equity and equality. In other words, people tend to use one term when they really mean the other, right? And remember, when we started this class, I said, this is one of the things I want you to recognize. I want you to recognize the use of language, the way people are using language to make arguments. Are they using valid language, or are they changing it, right? This was Wittgenstein's concern when he wrote his essay on language games, he called them, right? So he was sort of calling out what I called sophistry earlier, remember? I wonder if Wittgenstein would have liked hanging out with a bunch of lawyers. Something tells me he would not have, because they're the sort of the masters of the win, right? Because lawyers are in it to win it, right? Clever language, whatever it takes, and sometimes that works out, and sometimes maybe not so much. The question we're asking is it morally right? Right? That's a little bit of a different question. So another difference, equality. This is another thing I pulled off as I was, doing some research on, because as I said, these things change over time. So I like to see what the current. Well, this is from a current publication. It says equality simply means everyone is treated in the same exact way, regardless of need or any other individual difference. Equity, on the other hand, means everyone is provided with what they need to succeed. Now, just there in those two sentences, I think you can start to see the sort of the rub, this is one of the reasons why I think we have so many challenges in our society these days with people on very polarizing discussions and things like that, because it's hard to marry the two together, right? So these are just some graphics to help you. You can look at these, later on, but there's just some graphics to kind of wrap your head around the differences between inequality and equality, right? This is one way of looking at it. And then equity versus justice. Do you kind of see the difference? You see, with justice here is taking action to correct something to make it equitable. You see, that's why they push the tree, the boards. So somebody had to put the boards there to push the tree up straight so that the fruit would fall. Do you get the point? Okay. So these things, see, inequality, this is one way, and this now what I want you to think of this is sort of that concept of the state of nature, because that's where we start to get into problems. It's like, okay, well, what were you born into, and I'm going to tell you, I'm going to get into that in a little bit about how you sort of come into the world is part of the challenge here, right? So this debate, as I said, I don't think it's any great surprise to anyone here, is turning into debates across our entire society. I mean, I just pick a topic these days and we can kind of couch it into what we're talking about here. So this is one of the, I took two quotes, and I won't tell you where they're from, but these are from two different major news organizations, okay? You might be able to tell which one is which, I don't know. But so the first quote I found was, it's the difference between equal treatment and equal outcomes. Equality means equal treatment, unbiased competition, and impartially judged outcomes. Equity means equal outcomes, achieved if necessary by unequal treatment, biased competition, and preferential judging. Then in a different one, and these were just actually over the past few days, these publications were out. The second one is, it says equality of outcome is predicated on the idea that only certain measures of equality is outcome, educational, social, and occupational. Equity advocates assume axiomatically. That means they assume fundamentally. Remember we talked about fundamental moral principles? That's what that means. And they assume axiomatically that if all positions at every level of hierarchy in every organization are not occupied by a proportion of the population that is precisely equivalent to that proportion in the general population, that systematic prejudice, racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., is definitely at play, and that there are perpetrators who should be limited or punished that have or are currently producing that prejudice. So this would, by the way, I think this might be in the notes. So you can, I think I put it in there if you look in your notes later where they're from. But the point is I mean, can we match? Is there a way we can figure out how to synergize these two? This is the great challenge. Do you see how different they are when we're looking at them from think about the Heinz dilemma, for example. And now we're talking about equality and equity, but you can relate right back to that abstract. So let me give you some specific examples here to help you kind of make sense of the difference. So an example of equality, a city cuts the budget for 25% of the community centers by reducing the operational hours for all centers by the same amount at the same times. On the other hand, equity, the city determines which times and how many hours communities actually need to use their community centers and reduce hours for centers that are used as frequently. So there's one. The second one is interesting because over the past decade or so, there's been a big, this very polarizing issue. Sort of like on the one hand, it's like, well, if you come to America, you should be able to speak English, right? Or you should learn English or whatever. And then on the other hand, it's like, well, this is America. You can speak whatever language you can speak whatever language you want, and we should try to accommodate that. And there's valid points on both sides, right? So the question is sort of how do we decide? Do we just have that referendum? Let's take the community meeting example. Is that what we're going to do? We're just going to have a referendum? Well, what if, think about the referendum problem. That's that pure democracy, right? 51% of the vote says no. We're only going to speak English. We're not going to have any interpreters at the meeting, right? Well, then you just left out 25%. That's a big margin of error there. Remember I drew the Cartesian coordinate system and I put that in, we talked about the outliers. That's a lot of outliers, right? So I mean, these are the kind of things, these challenges that we have. This is just another one that I pulled off the internet that kind of differentiates between some of the terms that are being used these days, not only equality and equity, but also in this case, they call it reality and liberation, right? And the question people are asking is which one of these approaches is right, morally right in some cases. Other cases, you can one of the things I want you to do in this class is start to really kind of look into people's intent, listen to the language that they're using, those kind of things, in order to make sense if what they're saying is actually morally right, or if they're just trying to use clever language to use maybe you and me as a means to their ends, right? And this is very commonly talked about in political circles, right? You know, people will say whatever they need to say to get elected, and then when they get elected, doesn't work out that way. And of course, that has happened through history throughout the country. It's one of the challenges we have with the way our elections are held. You know, some people are with parts of Congress, especially, right, with the House, right, in the 2-year terms. You know, that always bothered me as an economics major when I was an undergrad, because we always talked about the long term, and the long term was always over 3 years. Sometimes it was over 5 years. And I remember even back then thinking to myself, there's something wrong when we have a 2-year electoral cycle and it doesn't even breach the long term. It's sort of like everybody's focused on the short term to the expense of the long term, is sort of like how I felt. And I've watched that sort of play out over the years, and so I don't have an answer for it. It's just something that I've thought about. So the next thing I wanted to show you is I found something from the Kentucky Department of Education. And this was a presentation that was given to a bunch of teachers to focus on equity. And so I want to see if you can parse out some dilemmas. And these are the actual slides, some of the slides from this conference. So here's their definition of equity. This is the promotion of access, opportunity, advancement of all individuals, including those in underserved communities, in order to identify and eliminate conditions that prevent the ability of all students to reach their full potential. The term underserved community refers to populations sharing a particular characteristic, as well as geographic communities that have been systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in the aspects of economic, social, and civil life. That's a lot to be said there. I have a long history of ties to Appalachia. And one of the things I thought of here was the form of government. My thinking went to the form of government. And I thought about the state of West Virginia. And I don't know if any of you are from Southern West Virginia, but it's kind of like where I grew up in the northern coal region of Pennsylvania. I mean, basically coal was replaced by textiles, and they shipped textiles in the late 80s overseas. And so all the jobs were gone, and the society became very poor. And part of the problem with equity in Appalachia, and you can look this up. I don't have slides for it. This is just stuff that I've been sort of like researching on the side over the years a little bit. But you know, part of the problem in Appalachia, think about it. If it comes down to votes, can you see the problem? If it comes down to votes, Appalachia doesn't have the numbers of people, right? They may have people that fall into this category to a great degree, right? And not just in West Virginia, right? Eastern Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, up into the coal region of Pennsylvania, that runs all the way up through, you know, Pittsburgh, and then into central Pennsylvania, where I grew up, you know. So when we think about those things, that can be a bit challenging. And I think it might be one of the reasons why, what is it, West Virginia and like Arizona are like the outliers on the Democratic Party right now because of certain things. And I haven't thought it through, but you know, these are the kind of things I want you to start thinking about. You know, because it's not for me to give you the answer; it's for you to start to consider these things. When we come down to things like a democratic vote, right? And what I mean by that is more of a referendum vote, right? That 51 to 49. That's all you need is 51%, right? What about, remember what I said about when I did the graph? I said, what about the outliers? Well, the outliers in this case might be large portions of very poor parts of America that just simply don't have the population concentrated enough to get the officials elected that they need elected to make changes. Do you see that how this could cause a problem? So this kind of thinking is sort of nice to hear, but when it's put into practice, sometimes it causes disparities. unintentionally granted. This was another slide they had. Policy development, including but not limited to the following: curriculum, technology, discipline, school schedule, extracurricular, and wellness. This is part of the, I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you read through these, you're going to see that there's a concerted effort to try to level the playing field, right? And it's leveling the playing field through action, by taking action and making policies, providing services. Except in this country, when we provide services, when the government provides services, when the government provides opportunities, whatever, however you want to phrase it, right, to one group, it has to come from somewhere, right? And so normally it will come from, well, it always comes from another group, right? And so equity is really, remember the slide where I showed you with the somebody put the boards and put the tree up? Well, somebody had to pay for the boards, somebody had to pay for the labor to push that tree up, right? And so the question is, it becomes a little bit more convoluted, if you follow, because now we're not talking about boards just pushing a tree up. Maybe we're talking about trillions of dollars in funding for something. Do you see what I mean? So this is why this is such a where you can apply this stuff almost anywhere. And I want you to start seeing things differently. Here's one of the quotes I found from this is one of their slides. They're quotable quotes. Ethical does not simply mean keeping your nose clean. Avoiding wrong is not enough. The imperative is to do what's right. Making good things happen for people is ethical. This was one of the slides at the end of the presentation, and I read this slide and I said, wow, this is such one of those feel-good slides. And it has absolutely no meaning to me whatsoever. I still can't understand it. Right? If you look at it in the context of everything we've just discussed, it's sort of like, okay, that sounds good. What do you mean by that? What is it worth? But this is a quotable quote. So they had a point to make. I wasn't at the conference, so I don't know what the point was. But when I just read the quote for what it is, I struggle with it. Here's a quote from a large university. This is recent. We believe college can be a reality for everyone, no matter your income or background. It's a matter of finding good information, the right people to help, and planning wisely. One of the major issues that we find in higher education these days that you're probably aware of is the fact that who gets to go to university or college, they call it over here, right? Over here, who gets to go to college? Does everybody get a shot at going to college? I mean, a lot of people are starting to rethink that now, right? They're saying, well, maybe the reason our universities have gone from #1 in the world, hands down, 20 years ago to, I think last time I checked, I think it was 17, right? I think I told you, I think it was 17. I remember seeing Finland ahead of us, and I was like, wow, that's where we're at, But the question becomes is, who sort of deserves to go to university? And that's a hard question to answer, because in some case, at the end of the day, we're providing accommodations. I mean, you might think that I'm standing here saying, and there's a part of me, I'm very merit-based when it comes to education, right? So especially coming from, part my second doctorate in the UK, very merit-based. I mean, when you walk into Oxford, you sit down in a, in your assigned room, and you take an examination. It's 3 hours long, and then a group of professors that never saw you before grade it. They don't know who you are. They don't know what your color is. They don't know where you're from, and they grade the exam, and you get entrance or not, right? Very, very merit-based. But even Oxford was running into a problem a couple of years ago. I saw an article about it because their campus was, and we see that in America too. I saw something about Princeton, and Princeton, it was Princeton. I think Harvard was the one that actually got sued over it, but it was about having too many Asian students on campus, and so they started to change their admissions policies to make it at least what the Asian American Island Pacific, that's their group now. They have this like group that they're suing Harvard. I think that's the group that's suing Harvard, if I'm not mistaken. But the point is really more about the problem. And the problem is now, at one point they're being, come to our university, they were being recruited, and now, whoa, hold on, there's too many people that look the same. We gotta change our policy, and then they're being sued. Now, I gave you another example that I studied in my first doctoral or my second doctoral thesis was with the military. Remember, I told you the military was trying to cut down on suicides from combat veterans, and they brought in this concept of spiritual fitness out of positive psychology. And the minute it hit the ground, MAF, and you can look up what it means. It's a something atheist organization, sued they actually sued the Army, because the Army was the first one to implement the program. The Navy and Navy followed on later. And I believe now they pulled back on that, but I'm not up to date on the most current research on their new. But I do know that they've changed the word spiritual into something else. I can't remember. Maybe it was emotional, or it's hard for me to remember. But you can kind of see, and this goes back to my point about things changing over time. So if you look at things like being static, on the one hand, it's really easy to fall into Kant's thinking, right? Because for Kant, it's simple. Things don't change over time. Lying is lying is lying is lying, period, right? But for a consequentialist, they're looking at the consequences, right? They're trying to see, well, wait a minute, we don't, diversity is a good thing. We need people in corporations that think differently. How can we, so the intent isn't to discriminate against another group. I wouldn't assume that would be their intent. Their intent is to help a disadvantaged group, right? So that later on, when you get out into corporate America, you're not sitting around the table. I told you I was at a company that hired out of 4 universities, different argument. I mean, we're from all, look different, everything like that. We had all the big D's going on around the table. The problem is everybody was educated at like 4 universities. They all thought the same. See, this is one of the big problems that I experienced. So the problem with equity, the real challenge was brought up by the philosopher Martin Heidegger, and Heidegger was an existentialist. So if you want to kind of you won't be tested on this, but if you want to look into it, you can kind of, existentialism is a brutal thing to study, but it's very relativistic based. Remember what I said with that kind of thinking, and moral thinking is what's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me, and that's okay, and we're all going to get along. Except the problem is we have to live in a society, and when you put the two together, sometimes that causes some challenges, right? So Heidegger, and I only brought the Nazi Party in there to kind of point something out, is by his affiliation with that, he was banned from the universities later on. Even though he wasn't sort of an active participant in it, just the fact that he was a party member at one point, he was banned from the universities later on. He resigned his rectorship, and his dismissal from teaching was really related to his party affiliation. But his greatest contribution had to do with his concept of thrownness. And this is what he meant by what I was trying to talk about earlier, is how we come into the world, right? And I think in a lot of people's minds, when we talk about equality and equity, it's very difficult to sort of completely separate the two, because the fact of the matter is we're not all equal, right? I mean, I'm never going to be 7 foot, not unless I get, I don't know, longer leg surgery or something like that. I don't know, maybe that's the next new thing that's coming around, to level the playing field. But that's what you see in our society. People are trying to level the playing field on one hand, and on the other hand, other people are looking at those actions and saying, no, those are wrong. They're not leveling the playing field. They're taking advantage of the system, or they're taking advantage of a policy or something like that. And these are the things I want you to try and reason through so that you can see, those differences, right? Now, the Rand problem, how many of you have heard of Atlas Shrugged or Ian Rand, the philosopher? Atlas Shrugged is movie. Anybody see the movie? Anyway, one of the things, let me tell you a little bit about Rand's background. Rand grew up, her father was a pharmacist in Moscow, right? And she was, I believe, 12, 13, something like this, around the time of the Russian Revolution, right? This was the Russian Revolution after the First World War. Her parents had worked very hard to build this pharmaceutical business in Moscow, right? Then the Soviets took over, they took the business, and they lost everything, and they came to America. This was her childhood, and I think it really affected her thinking later on. She was very anti-socialist. In her mind, socialism led to laziness, right? And that's my term, laziness. I don't remember. Her books are so thick, I can't remember if she actually used that term, but she uses the term opting out. And this is, you can see this today, right? This is, anyone finish this sentence? This has been said as the year of the great reset. That's one. Resignation, that was the word I was looking for. It was a different R word. The year of the great resignation. There's a lot of people in certain industries, whether it has to do with COVID or politics or whatever it might be, they're like, you know what? I'm out. Well, Rand wasn't even popular, 20 years ago. She's become popular now because the predictions she made back in the 50s are coming true. People are opting out, right? People often ask me, I'm going to age myself a little bit, but does anyone remember the show The West Wing? That's rather good. There's a couple, thank you. I always liked that show because it was sort of like the ideal presidency. The president in this show was a Nobel Prize winning economist, a PhD. He was always the smartest guy in the room, right? And I thought to myself, isn't that sort of what we want in our society? People often ask me that. It's like, why isn't she the president? Like, she's just obviously the smartest one in the room. Why isn't she the president? And my common response is because some of the people I know have been encouraged to run for president. H.R. McMaster, for example, I know he was Colin Powell. I'm affiliated with a group where Colin Powell, who recently passed, they wanted him to run for president years ago. You might not remember that. And he was, after talking with his family, he was like, "Oh, I'm done. I'm not getting into that." And it's the same kind of thinking. So the question is well, why don't we have these people that are willing to take this? And I'm not going to give you the answer. You can kind of reason through that and figure that out. But Rand wrote this book, Anthem, it's called. And in Anthem, we and the collective are good are good just as social now designates what is morally right. And what first seems to be a description imperceptibly turns into a prescription. So what did she point out? She pointed out what we brought up earlier about is and ought. That's what she's doing here. She's bringing up the is ought problem. She's saying just because something is doesn't mean it ought to be, right? And so when you're talking about distributive justice, a lot of times people consider it in terms of just because something is happening doesn't mean that it's sort of like the train that you just assume you can't stop it. And so it's sort of like, well, can we build another track off to the side? Right? Remember our trolley car dilemma? Maybe we could just build another track. That would have been a great way out of it, right? A track with no people on it, then we turn, everything's good, right? But Rand recognized that there's a problem with even that kind of thinking, right? Now that last bullet is important. Now equity means the moral imperative to ensure equal outcomes. Okay, now that's key. This was Rand's thinking, but she recognized the problem with that. The problem with equal outcomes is the same problem we had with consequentialism, which is what? Do we know that? Are we sure about what the consequences are going to be? No. Right? So this becomes a problem that we have to sort of try to figure out how to deal with and balance. And I think the great thing about having a society like ours, if we can ever get back to normal discourse in our society and actually listening to people and trying to understand each other's perspectives instead of just shouting at each other, maybe we can start getting to a point to figure some of these things out a little better. So the next class we're going to talk about, I'm going to start off and we're going to go through virtue ethics a little bit. We put that off to the side. So that's what I'm going to start with next time. And we're going to tie virtue ethics into corporate responsibility, because in corporations these days, they're running into all these problems that we've gotten to up to this point that are caused by utilitarian consequentialist thinking. And they're reverting all the way back to Aristotle to try and figure out a solution. And we'll talk about that next class.